Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and mediocre white male editor of the American Mind. I am joined this week by superior white male editor, superb, the best white male we could find, Mike Sabo, managing editor of the American Mind. That's a joke for any employment lawyers who are listening. The Claremont Institute does not take race into account. I don't even know what disclaimer I'm supposed to make, but I promise that I don't speak for the Claremont Institute's hiring practices, and they're entirely up to code. I mentioned this idea of the white male, the mediocre white male, because there's a big viral piece about it that we're going to get into talking about today. It's just me and Mike. We got a little holiday twofer for you going on here. Our beloved boss, publisher and president Ryan Williams is unfortunately out sick. So thoughts and prayers to him. But as we sometimes do, Mike and I are going to take this double act on the road. We'll get to the piece it's really about DEI hiring and what it did to millennial white men in Compact just in a bit. But first, we have to cover some heavier news. I mean, DEI discrimination isn't great to talk about either, but this, it's fair to say, is even worse. We had a series of really bad news stories, starting with this shooting in Sydney, Australia, on Bondi Beach, which is one of their beaches, on the first night of Hannukah. So Sunday night, I believe, was the first night of Hannukah, and there was this big gathering, over 1,000 people at Bondi Beach, kind of a celebration, people playing music, it sounded like, in the water. I mean, your typical just like public party. And there followed the deadliest mass shooting in Australia in almost 30 years, 15 people dead, as well as one suspect. The two suspects, Sajid Akram and not his son, Naveed Akram, the younger man, the son, survived. Sajid was killed in a gunfire exchange with the police. The names there are exactly sort of the sorts of names that you think they are going to be in this kind of context. This is a clearly, although I suppose we should say allegedly, but pretty obviously religiously motivated, if not also racially motivated crime. The people being shot at were obviously Jewish or friends of the Jewish people, and this was a major Jewish festival and celebration. Meanwhile, in Germany, thank God this didn't come to pass, but there was yet another attempt to drive a vehicle into a Christmas market. This is a big thing in Germany and some of the other countries in Europe. I've been to some of them. They're really lovely kind of open air street markets. You can find them in England. There's some even in America, but it's really Germany where the Christkindlmarkt, I think it's called, is the kind of beautiful annual ancestral tradition. And there have been fatal attacks on them in years past. 5 men were arrested in Germany after being suspected of getting involved in a plot to drive a vehicle into people at a Christmas market. It's interesting to read the BBC on this. We've been discussing, and probably will get into discussing, the ways in which Britain and Europe are farther down the line than we are in the mass migration crisis, and also the demographics of it are different there. So one result of that is the stakes are heightened, and sometimes that means people are being forced to talk about these dynamics a little bit more than our press yet has been. And I state all that because the BBC writes 3 Moroccans, an Egyptian, and a Syrian were detained on Friday over the plan to target a market in the southern Bavarian state. That's not a way that I would imagine the Times would typically report on this, getting the nationalities up there in front. But it's become impossible to ignore that this is a part of Europe's immigration discussion, that there are these increasing violence and the threat of violence in the streets of Europe. So those are the two, I think, most perhaps pregnant events to talk about in this context. If you feel like they're the most charged, maybe is the word I want. But there was other violence as well. The beloved director Rob Reiner was shot, it looks like, by his son, which is a terrible tragedy. Trump had one of his truly awful tweets. There's just this is one of the ones that even people like me who like Trump probably can't defend, where he said this is about, he sort of links this somehow to Trump derangement syndrome. But this is clearly just a tragic story. Rob Reiner, the director of the Princess Bride, of the beloved movie, among a bunch of other ones. And we wanted to mention that, to throw it in here among the other sort of shootings, as well as this school shooting at Brown, which police are still looking for the perpetrator. They've released an enhanced photo to try to get people sort of assisting in the search. But the shooting killed 2 students at Brown and injured 9 others. Details still unfolding there as of this recording. It's an ongoing case. But Mike, let's start with these 2. I mean, it's kind of amazing. It's like an anti-Judeo-Christian violence theme here, with this Jewish celebration followed by this foiled plot in a Christmas celebration. What is there to say about this stuff besides how awful it is? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think like when anything like this happens, shootings, especially what's happened in Germany, in recent years, you had kind of the spigot open up with Merkel and probably about 2014, 2015. So you have just, mass immigration, from that point on. And even obviously it started before that, but that's when really the spigot really got turned wide open. In Australia, I mean, obviously they're, famously, their gun laws are very, very strict, very severe for gun ownership. Nothing like the Second Amendment, obviously. But, even there, this kind of thing happened. And I think in this case, it was, if I remember correctly, I think it was a father and a son, actually, who committed these murders. And, in Germany, too, it's amazing that, they were able to foil kind of that plot before it happened. Thank God. And I wanted to point that out too. Actually, what you pointed out was, showing, the alleged perpetrators of this planned attack, this truck attack in that German market. They were right out with, where these people came from. Which, I mean, famously, if you read anything from the New York Times, anything from the BBC, that they will never lead with that. Not only will they not lead with that, that's actually never even part of the story. I mean, you'll actually have to find out, kind of what they leave behind and what they leave out. You can kind of guess what's going on there. So that was interesting that it's just gotten to a point where, and actually linking to what we're going to talk about later with the Jacob Savage piece at Compact, where it's getting so obvious that the elites themselves even can't almost kind of turn away subconsciously anymore.
This is such a great connection. The minute you said it, I was like, oh, I hadn't put those together. But right, this is stuff that's now it can be told.
Right. It's so obvious that you have to at least say something about it now, because if you don't, you just kind of almost look like a coward or something. And again, this is even to the establishment people now. So this might be kind of that same kind of scenario where people are understanding now. Look, I mean, peoples and cultures matter to ways of life, and that there is something here. I mean, it's kind of the atheist who was, I think it was Dawkins, who said, okay, I'm still an atheist, but cultural Christianity actually is important now to me. And I see what happens when that's attacked over and over and over again. So I think you're starting to see the limits possibly of in the elites. I mean, because even in that Savage piece, I mean, that's really what it's directed to. And I'll save that for that segment. But it's really about, the elites talking amongst themselves. And I think that this is one of those things possibly where, even they have to start recognizing, look, just for our own self kind of interest, just getting reelected. I mean, Keir Starmer having any possibility of getting reelected, which that doesn't look good right now, obviously. But I think it's just reality is just kind of butting in just a way that they cannot discount anymore. I mean, even what happened at Brown too, just kind of linking that to, the Charlie Kirk assassination. I mean, from reports I've read, so the college Republicans vice president Ella Cook, she was one of the people killed. I mean, it sounded like from everything I've read that she was actually specifically targeted. Um, so you have that problem in America, and then just combined with the problem of mass immigration elsewhere, and it's not good. And even to go to the Reiner thing, which obviously that's not necessarily connected, but it's a very sad case to have. I think their son, who has had I think a lot of substance abuse issues, and he actually killed, I think, with a knife both Reiner and his wife. And it's just, yeah, it's a very sad situation. So prayers obviously for that family. I mean, Trump stuff, politics, that this is the kind of time where I think you just push that to a side and really sit down, pray for their family, pray for obviously the things like that just don't happen. I mean, it's horrific just in the family too. And then you do look, obviously there's a retrospective back on Reiner's career. And I was just looking over on like IMDb, just the series of movies that he directed in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, it's that kind of runs amazing. I mean, Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, and it goes on and on and on and on. I mean, just, When Harry Met Sally, I mean, just one kind of cultural, pinnacle after another. So,
yeah, When Harry Met Sally is a particularly poignant one, I think, because that is noted as an originator or a source of the romantic comedy genre. And lately people have been noticing that romantic comedy has become impossible for all sorts of reasons. I mean, famously, comedy depends on this shared culture that we can all kind of grasp the references. It depends on a shared set of expectations about romance and sex, which even in the kind of wild days of the 90s and 80s was still in place, and even digressions or deviations took place against a backdrop of expectations. And now those things have all disintegrated, and there's a horrible crisis of romance in general, and the rom-com has been one casualty of that. You've seen Abigail Schreier and a few others write about this in recent days. And so that's also sort of a lost world to some extent, or one that people are trying now to feel their way back to. I think it was Reese Witherspoon, of all people, who said basically it's bad that we've lost this. She didn't say it very eloquently, and I always get her confused with Renee Zellweger, so it may have been her. And by the way, also, I think you corrected me earlier, Mike, that Reiner was stabbed and not shot. So in general, where am I? Who are you? What day is it today? In any case, all I'm saying is agreeing with you about When Harry Met Sally. And by the way, Katz's Deli, where the famous scene took place in that movie, and she's eating a pastrami sandwich, is a real deli. You can still get the sandwich, so far as I know. I've had it. It really does live up to perhaps not quite the expectations created for it by that particular scene, but it's a great sandwich. This larger point, though, which I want to get back to, and this is such an important thread that you're pulling on here. I was talking to my dad the other day, and he said something like, we don't have an honest media. And I said, it's actually worse than that. We do have an honest media, just at a 6-month delay, which makes people even crazier. And we've touched on some of these examples before. The big one for me is COVID. If you read the New York Times reporting now on COVID, it's excellent. Suddenly, the New York Times is like the paper of record on the ways in which scientific integrity was compromised, and money and politics kind of got into the bloodstream of our supposedly neutral and trustworthy institutions. And this is a big problem because of the cratering of public trust that ensued. I mean, there was like a massive piece in the Times recently about immigration and how Biden was warned way in advance during the Biden administration that his approach was catastrophic. And of course, it's impressive when the Times does something like this, because they have a lot of reporting power and they can really get you interesting scoops. The thing that is never, ever acknowledged, though, is that during the actual event, while this was going on, it was the Times, among other places, that was insisting there was nothing to see here. Long, long opinion pieces, but also news articles about how conservatives seem to think that immigration's a big problem. But actually, if you look at the data, it's obvious that they're idiots, and there's no mea culpa ever issued about that. And so even the honest reporting has the effect of driving people like us insane. Like, how is it that you can just come out with this now. My aunt said on the transgender issue that the Times is doing a gentle, soft shoe off stage. In other words, they're also running stories about how actually transgender quote unquote care and medicine can be incredibly damaging. And we don't really know if it has any of the effects it's supposed to have. And it certainly does have all sorts of adverse effects and doesn't improve suicide rates and all of these other things that, again, were there to be known. They were in reporting by the aforementioned Abigail Schreier, whose name I can never pronounce, and it was there in the open, but it was also forbidden to say and to talk about in certain official outlets. And yes, the effect that you're seeing is these things becoming impossible to ignore. How many times do you have to catch a bunch of people, I'm sorry, with guys like Ahmed getting ready to drive a car into a Christmas market before you start noticing, right? Before even the libs at the Times start to run stories and talk about this and say, well, what do we do about it? Of course, the problem is that in many cases, by then, it's too late. The damage from COVID is long done. I mean, the kids that had years of their lives taken away, whose development has been demonstrably affected, whose reading scores are way behind what they're supposed to be, who can't string a thought together without talking to AI, like all of that, I'm sorry, that ship has sailed, buddy, like dunzo. And so this new kind of spate of questioning that we're all like turning toward, and we will get into the Savage pieces like this too, it's like the solutions to these problems now are going to be so much uglier and more difficult and less effective than they would have been if these crazy people that run these news outlets would just have acknowledged that there was a problem. It didn't even have to be that they agreed with conservatives about what the solution was. I'm not even saying, wow, it's bad that other people feel differently about how America should operate. I'm not even saying, wow, I wish that everybody was right winger or a constitutional conservative or any of the things that I think it's good to be. I haven't even gotten there yet. I'm just saying it would be so much better for all of us if the people in charge of our supposedly prestige institutions could take the bare step, the first step of acknowledging that these things are a problem, that you can't just airdrop whole separate populations into countries and expect there to be no turbulence, that you can't just shut down embodied life for years and expect people to get along just fine, that you can't just openly discriminate against white men in major industries across the economy and think that you're not going to create a disaffected class. Like, if you could just get to a place where we admit that and then we talk about how to fix those issues, we would be miles away from where we are now, which is like looking back on the ravages of all of these failed policies and ridiculous ideologies and figuring out what's our best worst option, what's our least bad possibility here. Anyway, I'm ranting a little bit, Mike, but you've hit on something very important here about like now it can be told is a gesture that we're seeing a whole lot, and it's kind of it makes you insane.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important to point out. I mean, I just reminded of, I think this is Hegel in Philosophy of History, as this famous quote about the owl of Minerva flying at dusk, where, and in that sense, it's, philosophy. I mean, can it actually help us in any way? But then transferring that lesson onto here, it's like, okay, great. We knew about DEI for a long time. Like, none of this is new. But what is important in a way is, look, as much as conservatives would want to think, New York Times is probably not going to be going away anytime soon. The Washington Post was just bought by, a billionaire many, many, many times over. That's not going to go away probably anytime soon. Whereas CNN, I mean, there is an America, in a future where CNN may not be there in 5 to 10 years. That's possible. So as much as conservatives love to rag on kind of these institutions and elite opinion, look, elites aren't going anywhere. Institutions themselves aren't going anywhere. So it's more that we have to, see it as a good thing when they actually do somehow stumble onto the truth at times, even how late it is. At the same time, too, I think what this is this actually helps us. And I think we have to really, amplify this to such an extent and a lot more than what we're doing now, because to the intelligent reader, they're going to start looking at this and they're going to notice a pattern. It's Republicans pounce. It's, oh, Republicans lied. And then 3 years later, oh, actually, you know what? Actually, they were right about this, that, and the other. So I think we have to magnify that, and we have to show, look, the schizophrenia, I guess, for lack of a better word, it's there in the modern liberal mind. It's in the current set of elites. They're the ones who have their minds are all jumbled all over the place, because for them it's not about reality. It's just upkeeping this kind of ideology that they've kind of cobbled together that absolutely can't stand ever, especially without all this rush of institutions and people and universities and Hollywood and etc. trying to hold it all together. It's just not going to happen. So I think this shows to me how weak actually it is, and it shows an opening that I think we can certainly exploit. Kind of the contra Republicans pounce. It's look at liberal reality. I mean, there's nothing to it. I mean, it just falls apart, basically based on like the first instance of actually investigating what they're claiming and what their claims are. I mean, just remember what they said 30 minutes ago and now what they're saying now. So I think that is an opening for us. So we'll see. Maybe it's too optimistic, but
there certainly implies a degree of continuity in memory that I'm not even ragging on libs here. I'm just saying, like, at the age of 35, I am old. Even I am old enough to know that these things get memory hold real quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, of course, that's not to say we shouldn't harp on them. And you're right. Like, these are things that you can, if you keep them in the back of your mind, you can point to them. I mean, another data point you mentioned is the faith conversation. This thing that you alluded to, that interview with Richard Dawkins, a man who has done more perhaps than any other intellectual living to undermine people's confidence in their ancestral faith, as much as anybody else, to discredit the very notion of belief in God as backwards, foolish, something only the unexamined thinker, something only a kind of reflexive mind would even countenance. If you had looked for 5 minutes with a serious, cold, steely gaze, says Dawkins, at the data and the science, you would know that this is a ridiculous Bronze Age fable. And now he's still not walking any of that back, right? He's not like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has said something along the lines of, well, okay, faith seems necessary for social cohesion and for continuity and for great civilizations and all the things we cherish. Therefore, I should examine more seriously and with more openness the claims of religion. Right? So Dawkins is not doing an Ali thing, or a Charles Murray has recently done this too. Right? Taking religion seriously. He's merely saying, given the choice between public beheadings attended by cries of Allahu Akbar and Christmas lights and carols every December, I take the fairy lights and carols, right? That's basically his thing. And again, it's like, well, okay, buddy, but too little, too late, I mean, this is like just nowhere near the degree of seriousness required for like grasping the problem that you've effectively helped to create. There are other data points that we could add to this, but we should move on because we're clearly have lots to talk about in this realm, and we need to assess this Jacob Savage piece, which has gone, at least on X, the everything app, it's gone mega viral, and it's a follow-on. Not everyone may remember this, but this is the same author who wrote a piece about the vanishing white male author, or the vanishing male author. So this has been sort of a theme, and he is somebody who, for reasons maybe we can get into, is capable and competent to present these arguments in a way that these mainstream left-leaning audiences have to take notice of. The other kind of example of this phenomenon that I was thinking of as we were talking about this is Jonathan Haidt, who put forward in The Anxious Generation a bunch of kind of survey data and other things, but especially like, social science approved forms of argumentation, where he said, like, your phone is basically sucking your soul out through your eyeballs. And there's a level at which you feel like, well, did you really need a study to prove that was true, right? But also, okay, great. So now we have this book and people are finally taking this problem seriously. not just in our conservative circles. I don't know whether this piece will have that effect or whether it will get sort of sneered at as mediocre white men grumbling. But basically what Savage has done, the piece is called The Lost Generation, and it's about this cohort of people. Savage is, I believe, 40, he says. And so we're talking here about our age range, Mike, you and me, basically, people who started to enter the job market around 2014. And when I read this piece, one thought I immediately had is that we were kidding around on one of our editorial calls the other day, that when we discuss like the challenges, the financial challenges to millennials and below, we should have a segment where we all say how much money we make and how shut out we feel from, like, and so there's always, I guess I'm saying, a degree of like personal vulnerability here when you talk about these issues, because we are talking about dynamics that you and I have both experienced. And Savage is also talking about it like a dynamic that he has experienced. He begins by saying, I basically make my money as a ticket scalper, but I was this close to a career in Hollywood or in TV. And I got into this one writer's room one time, but then it just all fell apart. And the reason it fell apart, he says, is because in all sorts of industries, not just entertainment, but the Ivy Leagues, and he mostly focuses on a lot of elite kind of career paths, which is okay. That's an important dimension of this. He says there were these explicit decisions that there were too many white men in positions of power and high-paying jobs, and the remedy for this was going to be various forms of open discrimination against white men. We need this industry. We need Ivy League professors to be less white and less male. And they did this, importantly, I think, to the argument, Savage says, not by kicking out a bunch of boomers or Gen X leaders and administrators. I was reminded of an exchange between Stephen Colbert and one of these kind of wokesters, in which he said, well, you can't have my job. Wasn't the people issuing these calls that got kicked out of their jobs. They were already set, but then they basically just slammed the door shut on anybody younger than them. And so you have a situation now where, because boomers live long and because Gen X is also still basically in the prime, right, of their careers, you've got an upper level management that still looks exactly the way it looked. It's still offering careers to white men, or white men still hold careers there. And then a lower level management where suddenly all of these white men have been shut out of jobs which, and this is the other part which people will contest or argue about, jobs which they deserved, right? So the second part of this argument is like, it was not that white men were being unfairly elevated. I mean, maybe there was some of that, but also there was generally a meritocratic principle operative here. And some of these industries were ones where, for any variety of reasons that you can get into, like, white men overperformed, or they performed at parity with their representation in the population. That too is too much, or whatever. And so then it turned out, and the uncomfortable thing in many of these industries was like, there simply aren't enough, brilliant Black, female, trans, disabled poets to hire the best poetry teacher in every school and also pursue this DEI agenda. So often DEI became the priority over meritocracy. Academia is an area where I'm particularly sensitive to this, so I found this paragraph really interesting. He says cluster hiring, this is for professors, cluster hiring, which began in the 90s as a way to expand interdisciplinary research, was transformed in the 2010s as a shortcut to achieve diversity goals. Entire groups of underrepresented candidates could now be hired at once, working around the often Byzantine tenure approval process. The way you try to demographically diversify without making it explicit is searching in areas where the areas are strongly correlated with gender or ethnicity, an Ivy League professor explained to me. A cluster hire in Latinx studies, a shout out to Ryan, since he's not here, I have to say, in Latinx studies, will gain you several Latinx faculty. A professor of transgender studies will in all likelihood not be a straight man, and a white male assistant professor of Black sexualities is closer to an SNL sketch than a lived reality in 2024. So what's interesting to me about this is it works in two different directions. It does create these excluded white males in sort of older millennial downward cohorts, and it inflates the number of programs, jobs, fellowships, funding that are going toward these concerns that have to do with identity, because they easily will guarantee you meet your quota and you look good kind of from the outside. So it both wokeifies academia and dispossesses or disinherits a whole generation of young men. And I will close by saying, there are things you can say to criticize this piece, and we'll get into talking about what some of its blind spots might be. But if we're all going to be out here wringing our hands about Nick Fuentes and the Groypers and all of the angry young men who are causing problems and generating think pieces, you have to reckon with this side of it also, right? It doesn't actually say this. Savage doesn't get into this, but you have to be willing to think about this as part of the angry young man problem. Is it at least possible that explicitly saying you are not really in line for the most prestigious jobs in our society, no matter how good you are, you're just born in the wrong time and body? Is it just possible that has had some adverse effects? Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think this piece is important for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously it confirms what we've all been saying for a very long time now. And it too, one thing that really struck me was the data. Inside a piece that is, I think well written, the prose is good, but just there's so much data that just kind of continues. This is Savage talking. The year I moved to Los Angeles, white men were 48% of lower level TV writers. By 2024, they accounted for just 11.9%. Since 2020, only 7.7% of Los Angeles Times interns have been white men. Between 2018 and 2024, of the roughly 30 summer interns each year at the Washington Post, just 2 or 3 were white men. In 2018, the New York Times replaced a summer internship with a years-long fellowship. Just 10% of the nearly 220 fellows have been white men. This is interesting with Vox. So this is Ezra Klein's kind of data explainer site. Back in 2013, when Ezra Klein came under fire for his startup's lack of diversity, Vox Media was 82% male and 88% white. By 2022, the company was just 37% male and 59% white. And by 2025, leadership was 73% female. I could just keep citing, and this just goes on and on and on and on. But it does also show to me, obviously, we know the character of our current elites, cowardly, weak in some ways, which, that should also show us, conservatives, especially who want to kind of have this, counterinsurgency, this counter-revolution, they're awfully kind of malleable at the same time. And so what are those planks? What are those things that we can use? Because you're talking about institution-wide, no matter Hollywood, the universities, etc. What are those things? And I think this is one benefit, too, of just kind of the Republican Party under Trump and just conservatism under Trump, just this rethinking that's gone on, which that we were so kind of ensconced in interested in ideas so much, and ideas are important, principles are important, but that material causes also have a lot to say too, power structures, as the New Left would call it, actual institutions. So I think that thinking about things in an institutional way, how did the left get here? How did they assert their hegemony? And how can we actually learn from even something like this into how to actually do that ourselves? So I think that that's, kind of an important lesson for conservatives, just kind of reading through this. But there's tons of data. There's tons of good anecdotes. This one about Jeff Goldberg at The Atlantic is just absolutely classic, and I think says all that needs to be said about the problem of DEI, but then underlying just acknowledging the reality of it too, and just kind of seeing through the I guess DEI, the paper tiger that it kind of is. Obviously it has claws and teeth, but at the same time, even these people can kind of, acknowledge what's actually going on. So he said, he described his hiring philosophy back in 2019 by opening up the possibilities of younger people, women, and people of color by imagining their rise in a deliberate way, I've just widened the pool of potential leadership. There's no quota system here. And then Goldberg was candid about another less comfortable reality. It's really, really hard to write a 10,000 word cover story, he said in that same interview. There are not a lot of journalists in America who can do it. The journalists in America who do it are almost exclusively white males. So that's the problem. And you can't just import more people who look differently to solve that problem. Like, it's a problem of education. It's a problem of really, I mean, shaping and forming the soul. It kind of reminds me in so many ways of like Iraq. Okay, we brought democracy because they did this thing called voting. And it's like, you want this like input output simplistic possible thing. But that's not how this works. I mean, it's like they want to like just totally go over, and actually, very differently than the early progressives who were very interested in education. You got guys like John Dewey. You have, Woodrow Wilson. You have other people, presidents of universities, who understood kind of how long this was going to take. And it's like the left now, though. I mean, it's like this kind of like microwave kind of thing where it's simplistic, and it's like they kind of want the changes now, but it's only kind of surface level stuff. Like, nothing they talk about will actually like do anything that they actually want.
Yeah, I wonder if they actually did understand how long it was going to take. I mean, because you're right, there used to be a form of progressivism that I could get like 1/4 of the way on board with, which is yes, there are genetic differences. Yes, there are differences in history and in culture, and all of these things have caused it to be so that there are group level differences that will produce inequalities through no pernicious action, right? Even if in the past there has been discrimination, it's also true that if you stop all discrimination tomorrow, there will still be differences that were not produced by scheming racists, but actually part of the natural diversity of humanity. That's all true. And yet, and I'm, again, sort of a squish on this, right? Like, I think these things are a lot more fungible than we think they are. Human nature is not a blank slate, but also humanity is a thing, right? That comes with certain capacities. And if you even just look at like, how quickly people get taller with one generation of better nutrition, you start to think, well, there's so much we don't yet know about how heritable traits are. And, again, I've mentioned Charles Murray already once for his conversion to theism, and now I'll mention him again to say, like, he's put a lot of good research out there to the effect that there are real genetic differences, and that IQ might be is affected by this and all of that. At the same time, like, you can believe that and say, nevertheless, it is possible to affect major sweeping changes here, and we should want to offer everybody maximal opportunities insofar as we possibly can. But all of that having been said, like, if you have that sort of realism, what you might call an optimistic realism about the differences in the human species, you are bound to think that it's going to take effort and time, right? And we did put in some of that effort in the years like leading up to and just following the civil rights revolution, but we also expected it to like magically fix these problems. And as you say, Mike, we reached a point at which the left said, like, in fact, we've done this so much now that the slate should be equal and it's not, and therefore you must be racist, right? But actually, we hadn't done it anywhere near enough and for anywhere near as long as it would have taken to fix some of these problems. And also, the the very time that we gave up on that effort was also the time at which we started saying, like, oh, all of these racial disparities must be the result of pernicious discrimination. I mean, this was really, people forget that Ibram X. Kendi is a real person who said these real things. Like, the only reason for people to be in neighborhoods that aren't good, the only reason for like more Black people to live in this relation to the overpass rather than that relation, the only reason for there to be more white males in, I don't know, like high fashion or whatever, the only reason is discrimination. And that was just a like preposterous and untenable position that made the idea of human changeability look bad, right? It's now given a bad name to the idea that, like, well, with careful, slow, patient effort, we can help people to rise above the station into which they are born. And that's an important component of what we think of as meritocracy, right? So instead of doing that, we just jettisoned this whole meritocratic idea, and we said, like, what we really need to do is keep adjusting the dials. We haven't cranked them far enough yet. And this was bound to be a disaster. It was foretold to be a disaster at the time by people who knew that there would be a backlash. Now there is a backlash. I think, the question whether this about institutional organization and what form that takes is like one of the major questions of our time, right? Because we are obviously reaching a point at which we just have to talk about the period of anti-white discrimination that we have gone through. And the many people will want then to react by saying we need pro-white discrimination, or we need like white racial organization, or we need, and the sort of question of what that looks like and what it would look like to like right this ship is one that we are now going to be like forced to discuss. And I think that that's going to be like a very messy and a much messier and uglier discussion than it could have been if we had avoided going down the Kendi road altogether and to begin with. But we are where we are, I guess.
Yeah. And it's kind of amazing to think in retrospect too. I mean, think where we were in 2008, Obama winning the election. I mean, some post-racial America. And then what would emerge still, during Obama's presidency in 2014 and then onward, and then wokeness and DEI. So, I mean, that's just kind of amazing to me just to think about that all in retrospect. I mean, it didn't go away. It actually just intensified, times 10. So I did want to bring up too, because you mentioned that there was some interesting commentary just on this. Our own Jeremy Carl, senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. So he, on his Substack this morning, published some, which I thought was really interesting. So he's obviously has written a book about this problem, white discrimination, and just the myriad problems that this has caused, and just the blot that this is on our country. And so, he liked the piece overall, but gave it 2 cheers instead of 3 cheers. And at least a couple of the reasons why is, he cites kind of Savage and just kind of the liberal establishment. He says basically at some point they still do believe just kind of in the system as the way it is. Like the institutions, okay, maybe they need to be kind of changed at the margins or this or that, but nothing really fundamental kind of needs to change. He says, these are people, so-called homeless liberals who at some level still believe in the elite system and refuse to give up that belief, even in the wake of overwhelming evidence, such as in this case, overthrowing the entire idea of meritocracy, that it has betrayed them. And he also says at the end of the day, I mean, the problem is, it's like, look, the establishment that denied opportunities to Savage and his millennial and Gen Z white male cohort are not, as Savage seemingly implies, basically good people who unfortunately had the single moral or intellectual flaw that they happen to discriminate against white men. They are horrible people who are totally unworthy of controlling the commanding heights of our society. They are moral monsters, racist, sexist, and intellectual cowards, and they and the corrupt institutions that they have run for decades must be either reformed completely with their incumbent leadership ousted or else destroyed. So I think that is certainly a trenchant criticism kind of this in general. I mean, Savage doesn't go into it a lot, but he certainly kind of shows his cards, I think, near the end by saying, look, I mean, this, I was confronted with this idea of just this fake idea of meritocracy that kind of the millennial generation had now has to confront this new one. But there's not a lot of, at least maybe as what we would want, kind of self-reflection on, the people who did this to him and to a bunch of other people. Like, you kind of want to see some fire in some ways. You want to see some change. And it's just kind of at the end of the day, kind of, oh, ho hum, this happened. So I think Jeremy's, certainly onto something with some of those criticisms.
Yeah, I think this is part of the fact that Savage is talking about a very specific stratum of our society that is the top one. I mean, it's really elites who go into careers in film and television or academia. And there is a section in the piece called Everything Else, basically. But it's not, it's an afterthought for a reason. It's structurally an afterthought as well as sort of an afterthought in the sequencing, because this kind of discrimination and this ideology took a very different form, actually, for middle and lower class people than it did for those of us, and I count myself here, in the upper echelon of sort of arts and culture, right? Like, it's very, very hard to succeed talking about things, writing about things, making art, just in general. It's always a bit of a crapshoot. It is something which, if you are trying to do it, there's a good chance that your failure does not mean like the foreclosure on your mortgage, like, unless you are devoted to not doing manual labor, or like, you and I, Mike, have things that we could do if we were dispossessed, alas, of the opportunity to do the things that we most love and cherish.
That's right.
And also, like, in those fields, I think Jeremy is right that, like, there's a philosophical commitment to this ideology that we at least have to reckon with, even if Savage doesn't really seem that interested in reckoning with. Like, it's a little bit different if you're a mid-level employee at I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of, like, what's the, if you work an email job, or if you're a construction worker, right? You probably are less likely to be as, like, systematically discriminated against, and also for reasons that are slightly less ideological and more to do with, like, a company padding their bottom line. On the other hand, the stakes are higher, and you're likely to be more, and justifiably more, angry at the whole system if you find that you have to take some kind of diversity oath at your construction company or lose your job, right? Like, that's just, the stakes of that are higher for people lower down the socioeconomic spectrum. So there's, like, a disparity there, and I'm not quite sure what to do with it, because I'm sort of the opinion that arts institutions, cultural institutions, are bound to have a liberal streak in them. They're, by definition, kind of transgressive, and artists especially are always pushing at the edges of the status quo. And that's not something that, like, is only a feature of our, like, post-Enlightenment world or anything. You see it in the ancient world too. And so, like, the question of, like, I think in I guess, put it this way, in the construction world, and in the world of, lower class to lower middle class jobs, it's really, really easy to say, just sweep this stuff, like, make this illegal. Like, this kind of practice is probably already illegal and should be, if it isn't. At the level of our intellectually corrupt elite, you do need to kind of pose a counter elite, and you have to do it without making it a consolation prize or a sort of cringe alternative Netflix or whatever. And this is a nut that's been very hard for the right to crack, but I agree that it's something which, like, Savage doesn't really seem interested in this piece, at least in like, grappling with.
No, and I think this is something. I mean, you wrote about it, I think, in a great essay that started a symposium last year, just about culture and about what the right actually has to do. First, the problem, which is, like, the people who talk about the good, the true, and the beautiful. I mean, okay, well, what things have they produced with those attributes that's actually lasting? I mean, you look at movies, you look at music, you look at, and on and on and on and on and on. And it's like, there's just nothing of any real lasting value that, say, people are going to listen to. Like, people listen to Bach today, who wasn't even really listened to even at his time really that much, was basically rediscovered later. What's going to be of our time period now? I mean, what's going to be lasting? What's not just going to be moth-eaten and totally forgotten? So I think, yeah, you do have that problem, and the right really has to grapple with that and think about, look, we, I think, have to reject this idea too that there's everything is political and there's a political solution to everything too as well. So I think in one respect, conservatives and the right, I think under Trump have grappled with the idea that, look, things that were against, say, conservative orthodoxy, tariffs, etc., like those actually should be options on the table. Now, they may not be always helpful or useful, but those are options that statesmen should have to be able to, achieve some good. And that traditionally and historically, that's been true for American history and true certainly since the Republican Party formed in 1854. I mean, you look at Lincoln on tariffs and onward and onward and onward. But I guess the point is that we have breaking free kind of this like post Cold War ideology, I think has been very important. And I think this is the next step of kind of doing that, which is to build a culture that's really worthy of us, that's really worthy of America. Hopefully we're going to be doing some of those things next year. I know we are at the American Mind for celebrating the 250th anniversary, but I think that is certainly a project that, conservatives should take away reading this is, we have to build and not only build, but build well.
Yeah, it's one thing that's helpful about this piece is that there are 3 points it makes and defends, each of one of which is a crucial component of the argument that turn it into something other than belly aching about not getting the job you want, right? Because the obvious response to this piece is always going to be, well, you just couldn't hack it. And instead of acknowledging that, you've turned it into a whole philosophy of the world. And I do know people. The problem is that this does happen, again, in careers that are really hard to succeed at, like the arts. Everyone who has ever failed to make it in the arts either accepts and internalizes that or invents an entire conspiracy theory about why, well, the execs wouldn't look at my movie because it was too daring, right? The showrunners didn't want to make my script about Susan B. Anthony because, like, I'm a strong, independent woman, And so there's a version of this argument that turns into, like, obviously suspect in that way. And Savage does 3 things that save him from that. One is he quotes people saying, we are going to hire fewer white men. Then he shows statistics demonstrating that those people's companies hired fewer white men. And then he quotes people saying, we would have hired these white men were it not for our imperative to hire fewer white men. In other words, there were actual candidates who were the best in their field, the most qualified, whom we passed over or we even screened out in the first round of applications because of our commitment to hiring fewer white men. So at least in the aggregate, right, at a kind of economy level discussion, this is happening. Doesn't mean that there aren't also people like who will tell you they got canceled when you look at their work and think, nah, it's actually just not that good, But it does mean that, like, that's not the whole story. In fact, that's not even the main story. Like, the main story is this giant nationwide, as it's been put, abandonment of meritocracy. And yeah, I think part of Jeremy's point is, like, we can't only just take this as a psychosis that settled upon us out of nowhere suddenly in the early 2020s. This is something that followed, or even 2014, I think, is the start date that Savage kind of gives it. Like, this is something that emerged organically out of a whole bunch of prior philosophical commitments that are also very ugly. And that's certainly true. And despite the fact that I think artists are always going to lean a little bit kooky, I don't think that these ugly ideas about, like, human, I guess these openly anti-white racist ideas are themselves inherently linked to artistic success or excellence in, like, the arts or anything like that. In fact, I think they're actually signs of a decaying artistic and literary culture. That the sort of thing that people start to focus on when they don't have any original or interesting ideas or observations about human individuals, which is what art is about. Like, if you can't say anything fresh or interesting about individual human stories, you start to come up with these cockamamie capital T theories about, like, oppression, etc. And that stuff I think can be cleared out But the question, is like whether institutions like the Times, for example, are salvageable, or whether they are simply destined to crumble inward upon themselves. And it remains, I suppose, to be seen. It's really not our within our power to bring the Times crashing down single-handedly. It does seem. Do you want to just throw out any kind of quick last comments about that? There does seem to be some movement in the entertainment economy that has nothing directly to do with these politics, although I do think they're related. There has been an effort, it seems like it's going to be a successful effort by Netflix to acquire Warner Bros. Warner Brothers Discovery, WBD. This is a battle between Netflix and Comcast and Paramount Skydance, all to bid for Warner Brothers. Netflix made the winning bid, but now it looks like Paramount is going to try for a hostile takeover, and there's also going to be regulatory hurdles, which is where Trump has sort of said that he has an opinion about how this should go, and it mostly has to do with the reform of CNN, which is in the mix here, in the running, because it belongs to Disney, I guess. I always forget exactly how these.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I can never get it all straight either.
But it's in the mix of things that might be acquired, for example, by Netflix or by Paramount. And Trump wants to see CNN reformed in the same way that CBS is sort of being, at least there's an attempt being made to reform it. My kind of very quick hot take here is that this is related only in the sense that one of the ways that these media institutions have destroyed themselves is by their commitment to absurd racial politics over excellence. They're also committed, for example, to algorithmic maximization over excellence, which is its own concern and sort of unrelated. But it hasn't helped that every original show, so-called original show, is like dwarves, but they're black women. That has not helped these companies and has helped to put them in the financial position where they have to do these giant mergers, and where Trump is coming after them and all of that. Anything else to say about that?
No, I think you're right. Just based on the products that they're producing, Jack Posobiec tweeted out. So I guess there's this new Netflix show, aptly named Queen of Coal. It's a trans woman dreams of working the coal mines, but in a town steeped in superstition and patriarchy, Carlita must fight to earn her place underground. I mean, and I just saw something, I think, recently where it was like over 40% of children's programming, I think, on Netflix is like LGBTQ themes somehow come in there. So, I mean, I think people are right to be worried. You look at, conservatives, I think, talking about antitrust. These huge mega corporations. John Arrett just wrote about that in our legal conservatism symposium. So I think there's a lot of factors coming in, with the CBS, kind of stake. What's Paramount going to do? I know that they just obviously bought, the Free Press. So you do at least have some kind of at least centrist, even, right-leaning ideas at times kind of seeping in there. Barry Weiss is obviously, being elevated. We'll see where this goes. But I mean, we cannot keep doing the same thing where, you look at even the music industry and it's like, what has happened? Why is, Queen and old bands being streamed so much, and you have some, new stuff, obviously Taylor Swift, but it just feels all stagnated. Like, what has happened? And so I think we need to break free somehow of the reign of, tech companies, of these big institutions that obviously have not worked, and something else needs to happen. So hopefully that's what I hope that this is kind of the very, very beginnings of just breaking away from the current media institutions, forming new things, and that actually, can actually provide some actual culture and some actual art, and not just, miming whatever the popular thing is of the day.
Well, Queen of Coal, I will be waiting for the musical. I loved Emilia Perez so very much that I'm excited for, trans drug dealer, the sequel, trans coal miner. Just to already feel like you're going to walk out humming the songs. But rather than recommending Queen of Coal, we should briefly touch on a few cultural wrecks. I feel the spirit of Christmas bearing down upon me. I'm trying to hold off the merriment and remain in an Advent state of of purity and meditation. But it's just around the corner. I've got a lot of sort of Christmas related recommendations, one of which I will save for, I think, my other podcast, Young Heretics. But I will just briefly plug the CRB Christmas reading list. Every year at the end of the year, we get our contributors together and say, what are a few books that you really liked? There, it can be found at ClaremontReviewBooks.com. And I just think it's like kind of one of the best end of year lists on the internet, because we've got a bunch of different kinds of authors with different areas of interest. And just as a proof of concept, I want to say that one of the books I picked up from the list is this novel, Vanishing World by Sayaka Murata, a Japanese author who's writing about a world in which everyone conceives by artificial insemination. There's no sex anymore. But some people kind of happen to do otherwise. They happen to get together and learn at least a little bit about romantic love. And our protagonist is this girl who was conceived naturally. And she lives in a world where natural conception is a weird, like, relic of the past. And that's the elevator pitch. That's the premise of the book. When Matthew Schmitz, who's the editor actually of Compact, published the Jacob Savage piece, when I told him I was interested in reading that book, he said, be aware it's weird. So I tell you also, if you do go with that particular recommendation, be aware it's weird, but it's weird in a way that betrays so much insight and just novelistic understanding, not of what a philosopher might think would happen if there were no natural conception, but of what people would actually do if there were no natural conception. And it's inflected with all of the weird sex stuff that's already going on in Japan. It's just, I thought it was a really creative and smart and insightful book. But I'm not just saying you should go read this reading list because you'll find weird Japanese novels. There's a bunch of, political books, history books. Heather MacDonald gives a wonderful tribute to Gone with the Wind. There's just a lot of stuff on there. Go check that out at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com.
And I would definitely second that. I wasn't able to, unfortunately, put recommendations this year, but I know I've done it in the past. And yeah, I mean, I think the first, second I saw that link, clicked on it immediately, dropped what I was doing, and read all the way through it. So it's fantastic. So my recommendations are just Christmas movies. I'm like you, Spencer, where it's Advent, but it is hard not to start listening to Christmas music and celebration. And so I've been watching a couple different versions of A Christmas Carol. I actually watched for the first time the Patrick Stewart version that came out, I think it was like 1999, made for TNT, I think, at the time. So I watched that. The George C. Scott one from, I think it was 1984. It was like a CBS, I think, TV movie at the time. It's still my favorite. Scott does such a great job. There's obviously like the Muppet Christmas Carol. Everybody loves that one. Obviously, Michael Caine's performance is great in there. But there, Home Alone. I think my wife and I watch that every year. So there are just, a lot of just great Christmas traditions and Christmas movies, especially out there to watch. So I'd recommend just definitely taking some time and sitting down and doing that next few days.
Wait, Mike, have you seen the 1951 Alistair Sim Christmas Carol, Scrooge?
I have actually not. No, I need to see that. I'm
sure I've talked about that on this podcast before. I almost recommended it and then thought I'm probably going to bore people if I do, but it's a tight, like 88 minutes or something. And it's just triumph. I mean, I really think many of the adaptations you mentioned are good. And I think any adaptation of A Christmas Carol is kind of brilliant. The novel itself is so beautiful, but that one is very, very special. But yes, also Home Alone, also The Muppets, of course. So many good ones. It's a Wonderful Life. I will go to my grave defending It's a Wonderful Life against all its many, many haters.
Me too.
There's a lot of good ones. Okay, I think that's all the time we got. These 2-person episodes always fly by, and thanks to our listeners for hanging out with us. If you want to know more about the Claremont Institute and all the work we do, you can visit our websites at americanmind.org and the aforementioned ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, where not only will you find a Christmas reading list to swell your stocking, but by the time you're listening to my voice, I think it's fair to say that the new double issue, 25th anniversary fall winter 2025 to 2026 fanfare please double issue will be dropping on the website, starting with pieces by Helen Andrews on Charlie Kirk, with Chris Caldwell on Zoran Mamdani, with Bill Vogeley on Never Trump, with Charles Kessler's adapted remarks from the 25th anniversary gala on the history of CRB, with yours truly on Julius Caesar and his use of the Latin language. Just a treasure trove, I think it's fair to say, and you should go check it out. You should subscribe if you haven't already, and you will get the physical copy. And you can also subscribe now to our CRB Substack, which is another kind of place to get extras for just a few dollars more. If you want to donate to support our work, you can go to claremont.org/donate. We're very, very grateful to all our donors in amounts large and small. I forgot also to mention our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And I could never forget, what callous monster would forget, our production and engineering crew, the brothers G, Jake, and Ryan Gannon. And of course, thanks to you all for listening. We will probably talk to you next week if we don't decide to take a break for the holidays. Watch this space.